pleasure to welcome today Dr. Terri Lewis. Dr. Lewis is an associate professor and associate director of research with the Kemp Center for the Prevention and Treatment of Child Abuse and Neglect, an associate professor in the Department of Pediatrics. She's a developmental psychologist who has done a lot of research on consequences of exposure to violence, perpetration of violence, and consequences of child maltreatment. She's now applying for the EPI position or EPI positions we have open, and it's a pleasure to welcome her today.
Thank you.
Here.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I know it's summer and it's nice outside, and I'm guessing all of you in the back are required to attend. Is that right? Students? No? So I guess I just want to start a little bit about maybe who I am and how I came to be here. I actually got my PhD in developmental psychology at Bowling Green State University in Ohio. It's easy to get a PhD in Bowling Green State University in Ohio because there's nothing to do there. It's like cornfields for miles. And terrible winters, so it was easy to get a PhD there, or at least finish one, I should say. I worked primarily around family conflict and the result of family conflict as it related to child mental health, particularly behavioral problems and internalizing problems, and was primarily interested in the general sort of family structure level work. Then I was recruited to the University of Missouri by Lizette Peterson. If any of you do injury work, Lizette was a pretty seminal researcher in that area. And she was in the midst of the toddler injury observation study. So we looked at unintentional injury among toddlers from around 24 months to 36 months. And followed them 6 months out and recorded injuries, daily injuries, through an event history diary. And so there is when I started my romance with longitudinal studies, although that one was only a 6-month longitudinal story. But then I moved to North Carolina and was thrilled to join the longitudinal studies of child abuse and neglect. And I'll talk more about that because I want to talk about that study in particular and some outcomes related to that study. But that was a 20-year epidemiological study of child maltreatment consequences of in a number of domains. It's an amazing data set, and we've had a number of ancillary studies off of the data that we have, which has been really great to sort of enhance both the data that were collected as well as the research going on with the data already collected. And then, because I could work anywhere I wanted to, I moved back to my home state of Alabama to be a little closer to family. And then when the executive director of Kemp Center came calling here, I was more than eager to come to enjoy Colorado. And I have been enjoying Colorado very much for the last 3 years. So that sort of gives you an idea of a little bit of where I come from. So I want to talk specifically about longitudinal assessment of behavior problems, substance use, and delinquency, as well as the perpetration of violence within the long scan sample. Okay. So I think you always have to have an objectives and things required these days, I suppose. But so what I'd like to do is talk generally about the prevalence and significance of youth exposure to violence. And my area is generally children, youth, and adolescents. Provide an overview of the social ecological model, as that's the framework that LongScan was developed within, and I think the most comprehensive model from which to think about assessment and organizing measurement models. Talk about some data specifically from LongScan, and then talk about some future directions in terms of where my work has been going. So first, the youth exposure to violence happens in a variety of contexts, from child maltreatment and primarily in the home, and then extending out, witnessing family violence, school-related violence, community-level violence, peer-to-peer violence, dating violence, And more recently, there's been an increased interest in firearm violence and exposure, in particular among youth. A lot of research generally looks at one type of violence, maybe just exposure to IPV or just maltreatment. But what we find is that there are a lot of overlap in the context of exposure, and any one exposure increases the odds that you'll be exposed in other contexts. And also there's a lack of attention to the developmental progression in terms of the context in which you can be exposed. David Finkelhorn and colleagues propose there's a developmental victimology framework where the youngest kids are exposed primarily in the home, child maltreatment, primary caregivers, family, and then as they get older and start moving into school and engaging more independently in their communities and neighborhoods, that the kind of victimization and the context in which they are victimized change over time. We tend to look at child maltreatment alone and look at consequences, but we really fail to take into account that developmental model to understand better the timing of exposures and the type of exposures. And we really kind of leave out, with the exception of community violence, adolescents' exposures, and we fail to take into account their earlier victimization experiences as well. So in terms of child abuse and neglect, child abuse and neglect is one of the better exposures that is surveilled. We have the National Child Abuse Dating and Analysis System, NCANS. That's a states report in referrals for child abuse every year. These are archived, I believe, at the National Data Archive for Child Abuse and Neglect, but only includes CPS reports. So these figures here are specific to CPS and the referrals from the more recent NCANS data, in which there were 3.6 million referrals, 702,000 victims that are not duplicated, and over 1,000 deaths attributed to abuse and neglect. Clearly, if you're looking at CPS reports alone, it's likely an underestimate of the true prevalence of child maltreatment, due in large part to the very secretive nature of abuse, particularly sexual abuse, as well as clearly documented biases in reporting in terms of who gets reported, and then those kids in the system tend to be followed more carefully. And so we miss a lot of kids who are otherwise neglected. So these represent a fairly probably underestimate of the true prevalence. If you look at self-report data from other surveys, including the NatSCEV, the National Survey of Child Exposure to Violence, these figures really look like more like 1 in 4 kids are reporting some kind of abuse experience. That also includes psychological abuse. Although we tend to think about abuse and victimization in terms of physical abuse and maltreatment, there's been a surge recently of data looking at psychological abuse and finding there's more harm in some cases for those who are reporting being psychologically victimized than those who have been physically victimized. The wounds heal, the heart doesn't. So if you consider just child maltreatment alone, boys are at higher risk of physical victimization than girls, and girls are higher risk of sexual victimization than boys if you look at CPS alone. Tends to be no differences with regard to neglect. And CPS does a horrible job of assessing emotional abuse, as you can imagine. So we don't have particularly good data on emotional abuse. Other contexts don't have the same kind of monitoring or surveillance system as child maltreatment does, so it's hard to get data about school violence and exposure to community violence. Teen dating violence, those all tend to be study specific. There are 2 surveys that are done pretty routinely, the NatSCEV, which I've already mentioned, David Finkelhorn and colleagues, and then the Youth Risk Behavior Survey out of the CDC. So using those data primarily, particularly Finkelhorn's study, that N is about 4,500 kids. It's a national telephone survey. and zip codes in which there are low income, African American and Hispanic are overrepresented in that survey. And his determination is that 60% of children and youth surveyed from 1 to 17 were exposed to some form of violence just in the last year of the survey. In 2011, the YRBS indicated there were almost 750,000 non-fatal victimizations in school settings, despite the influx at one point of the no bullying policies and the school violence reduction programs. There's still a significant amount of exposure there. In one study I did looking at victimization, witnesses and victims of violence in the last year of fifth graders, those who reported having either been witnesses or victims, 82% said that they occurred in school. There were other contexts, but they were reporting the majority actually was still in the school settings. 18% of students in 12 to 18 reported the presence of gangs in their schools. 7% said they would not attend school due to safety concerns or had not attended school in the last 30 days due to safety concerns. 20% report being bullied. Again, this is on the YRBS, but if you look at some of the other surveys, and particularly certain kinds of disadvantaged neighborhoods, urban areas, sometimes those bullying rates are closer to 80%. So it really depends on the survey and the population under study. In terms of, and I think 15% also reported electronic or cyberbullying. Obviously, that's become a significant area of concern more recently. And in terms of teen dating violence, also very difficult to assess what the true prevalence is because of the nature. There's definitional differences. There are differences in the surveys. Some include psychological abuse, some just physical victimization. So it significant variability, but 21% of females generally reporting some sort of physical victimization relative to 10% of males. If you look at psychological victimization, at least one study had 96% were reporting some sort of psychological aggression in dating relationship. I attended the Teen Dating Violence Workshop in 2010, sponsored by the National Institute of Justice, to discuss this issue of teen dating violence. How do we understand teen dating violence? And I think that what we learn there is our measures are, while we ask about events that have occurred, we may not be assessing the emotional consequences of those events to better understand, yes, because my partner threatened to push me in the pool is not really psychological aggression. So the 96% could be sort of endorsement on any of these things, but they're not necessarily connected to sort of an emotional consequence or whether that person felt threatened or concerned about that as a threat. If anybody of you have kids or are around teenagers in the pool area or anywhere, there's a lot of pushing and shoving and touching and stuff. And so it's, I think, a really tricky and tingly area to get into, and I think our measures are not very good at this point of truly assessing that out. Nonetheless, many kids experience some kind of witnessed or victimization experience, and as Finkelhorn colleagues, and again as the Longscan study also indicate, there's a fair number of overlap with kids being what's referred to as polyvictims. So those are kids that have more than one type of exposure or victimization. So they may have multiple child maltreatment, they may be sexual abuse as well as neglected, they may be physically abused and witness intimate partner violence in the home, or some in community violence in the home. So there's a lot of overlap in types of contexts, which makes it important that we understand that we should also be considering polyvictimization. In understanding almost half of those who have been victimized aren't single type of victimizations. So in terms of consequences, consequences of child maltreatment and exposure to violence, even just witnessing violence, has a range of poor outcomes in terms of psychiatric disorders, behavioral problems, substance use, academic difficulties, poor social competency, association with deviant peers, poor attachment to caregivers and to subsequent adult romantic relationships, sex risk behaviors, higher rate of pregnancy, higher rate of sex risk behaviors, including lack of condom use, higher rate of re-victimization, poor mental health in general, and delinquent criminal behavior. Kids who have experienced or witnessed violence also are at higher risk of being perpetrators themselves, either of violence delinquency in adolescence and adulthood, as well as intimate partner violence, teen dating violence, and subsequent maltreatment of their own children. In terms of frameworks, there's been a number of theoretical frameworks that have been put forth to either explain when children are victimized, who they're victimized by, why they're victimized, and the consequences of victimization. Social learning models suggest that aggressive behavior is modeled. They see either people in power do it, or they see peers who get rewards or things that they would like to have, money, Jews, power among their peers, and they model that behavior. There's a surgence of psychobiological models that suggest that the experience of victimization and exposure impacts the brain in ways that have an effect on the molecular organization, brain structures, including the amygdala. That's generally associated with regulation of emotion, and neuronal connections and pathways, myelization of neurons, and that these may either exacerbate existing vulnerabilities or create vulnerabilities for psychiatric and other mental health related disorders that then put them at higher risk of being victims, re-victimized, or being perpetrators themselves. However, in most of these cases, the variants explained, or what we know in terms of what the influences are explained very little by any given model. So we've had certainly a resurgence and a call for integrated models that combine some of these social models, developmental models, psychobiological models, genetic models, to better account for what is complex human behavior. One of the models that is often used as a framework is the social ecological model, which I've put up here. And that was in part based on the work of Yuri Brofenbrenner, who proposed that human behavior is influenced by a set of nested but hierarchical ecosystems that both impact directly and indirectly. Other scholars have extended that to include also transactional or interactional directions between environments, and to some extent a feedback loop. So at the most proximal level, the individual level, those can be things like gender, IQ, biology, then moving out to the relationships with families and peers, on out to the school environment, community, and public policy. Policy maybe, for example, welfare policy. When there was a change in the status of welfare, many families were impacted, increased the stress of economic concerns in families. The stress in the family then was subsequently increased with greater incidence of maltreatment reports. So the policy level actually can move down through these other ethos into the impact on the child itself. So, given the prevalence of violence and the significant consequences of violence, it's very important that we better understand the developmental trajectory, the etiology, and the path of the victimization, the consequences, and subsequent behaviors and of that. And as such, the CDC, the World Health Organization, other public policy agencies in the 1990s had indicated child maltreatment is a significant public health concern, and we needed more studies to understand the nature and trajectory of this, as well as the other context and risk and protective factors in a number of different domains. So to answer that call, the longitudinal studies of child abuse and neglect were implemented or pulled together. LongScan is actually 5 study sites plus the data coordinating center. The PI of the LongScan studies, Desronian, a few doors down, and pulled together 5 different PIs with 5 different study cohorts to play together nicely for 20 years. Was a feat in and of itself to do that. And they agreed to common bylaws, governance agreements, measurement protocols, and the data then were pulled together, distributed back out to the study sites for analysis. Each of the sites represents a continuum of maltreatment experiences. The southwest and northwest site are almost entirely CPS samples. The Midwest site, 2/3 of those were reported to CPS and 1/3 were neighborhood controls. All of the controls were matched to mirror demographic risk, primarily low income, low social support. So the whole sample is all high risk, but only about 65% of them had CPS reports prior to age 4. They were referred to CPS. The southern site, that was a stress and social support study. That was already, they were looking at child maltreatment among mothers who had just given birth that were of high and low social support. 50% have been reported to CPS. 25% of those low social support, 25% high, and then 50% not reported, 25% low, and 25% high social support. So all of these, in the eastern site, actually, those children came from Failure to Thrive clinics, were either prenatal or drug exposed, HIV, and 1/3 clinic controls. It's hard to get all those to play together for 20 years. So broadly, the study aims were to examine the antecedents of child maltreatment and combined forms of maltreatment, look at the adverse developmental, behavioral, cognitive, social outcomes over time of these kids, and to look at other factors associated with risk and promoted factors at different ecological levels, including the family environment, the community environment, and policy. Okay. If there's any questions, feel free to stop me, provided it's a positive pro-social comment. No, I'm just kidding. You can stop me anytime. So within that social ecological framework, we developed our measures and our approach, what we asked and when we asked within this ecological framework. When the kids were very young, we did some behavioral assessments, developmental assessments, and the majority of the data came from the caregiver. As the child got older, we relied more on the child and youth as their own informant while still getting caregiver reports. But the balance of who was reporting changed over time to be congruent with the idea of developmental victimology and the increasing knowledge of the youth about their own behavior that parents might not know as they get older. In terms of sample demographics, our baseline sample, we started assessing when the kids were 4, and we had 1,354 kids. Just a slight majority were female, 53% were black, 26% Caucasian, 12% mixed race. You could see by the race ethnic distribution, this was before NIH mandated that we report it differently, so it doesn't quite go with NIH standards to try to figure out where to put mixed race kids because they do not fit in NIH boxes, but nearly 12% of our kids were of mixed race. So interviews, face-to-face interviews were done every 2 years at ages 4, 6, 8, 12, 14, 16, and 18. Annual contact interviews were done on the off years. There's a gap between 8 and 12 because there's a funding gap. Happens. Because this is a long study, the method of data collection changed over time too. So initially they were face-to-face and a lot of paper, and then it moved to computer questions and answers, and by the time the kids were 12, it was an audio computer assisted interview where the kids had headphones. It was audio enabled, and they were able to answer the questions directly onto the computer. Maximizes their sense of anonymity, and we felt like they would answer more sensitive questions more readily than if they were to face-to-face. So that ACASI started at age 12. Phone contact was on the off years. We did collect data on the off years, but the phone interviews were a great way to keep the participants retained in the study and try to find out where there were lapses in contact and need to try to find where these kids were. We got data from caregivers, the primary caregiver at the time. With this sample, caregivers change over time. So that's trying to assess the role of the caregiver is pretty tricky. We had the child informant, and then we had teachers, and we also reviewed administrative records from Child Protective Services. We have a lot of data. Let's see. In terms of what did we assess over these 20 years, just about everything. We have caregiver factors, caregivers' own victimization experiences, caregivers' use of substances, caregiver employment, changes in the family, violence exposure, adverse events. We have life skills, resilience, pro-social behavior of the kids, friends and family, the kids' own use of substances, caregivers report of kids' behavioral problems. Some of our adolescents became parents themselves, so we have sex risk and pregnancy and parenting behaviors. We actually have the adolescent parenting inventory from the caregivers, and we have the parenting caregiver inventory from the adolescents at age 18. So that was a really nice sort of overload to see like how congruent those sort of parenting attitudes and disciplinary attitudes and developmental attitudes were consistent. Peer relationships, violence, criminal behavior, we have it all. So just to talk a little bit about some outcomes from all this, it's not, Longscan still has a lot of data left to mine. So any of your students back there looking for data sources, gotcha, I got you covered. So looking just at CPS reports alone, can see that with CPS reports that even up to age 12, there were still increases in the reports on these kids. Again, this is not necessarily unique to this sample because a lot of these kids were already involved in Child Protective Services, so they were probably being watched pretty carefully. Neglect is the most prevalent, followed by physical abuse, emotional abuse. Sexual abuse is the least prevalent. For Child Protective records, males were more likely to report physical abuse by age 12, and females sexual victimization. I'll talk a little bit about self-report. In that case, there are no gender differences when you ask kids about their own victimization experiences, except for emotional abuse, with more females reporting emotional abuse.
Excuse me.
Yes?
Your cases only, or is this your cases and your controls?
These are everybody. It's the whole sample. So 60% of the entire sample by age 12 had one or more reports of neglect.
So what do you do as they age across the continuum? If they start out as a control and then they suffer some type of violence, do they move into the case group then, or do they stay as a control group?
That's a good question, and they do. By the time that they're adults, none of them are free from some sort of adverse experience. But we don't necessarily always look at the data from that perspective because there's so much data. It really depends on the question. If you were doing sort of a time to or survival analysis, something like that, where they may change over time or switch groups, that becomes a little tricky for us. We tend to group. It depends on what the variable or predictor is or how things are grouped. But we do have, because of at least the CPS records, we know exactly when they were reported. Self-report is a little harder when we try to integrate that in. And then the violence exposures are asked every 2 years about in the last year. So it's a little fuzzy about when some things exactly happened, but when we include kids self-report of their own experiences, then 85% of the sample has been abused or maltreated. So there aren't a whole lot of real controls left at that point. Yes?
Can you explain a little bit what you call cases and controls in this context? Because I'm a little confused.
We don't.
Oh,
Don't.
Okay. All right.
We don't.
So it's exposed and unexposed, right? That's what you're talking about.
Really,
right?
what we wanted to do is we wanted to get a group of high-risk kids at varying degrees of risk and follow them longitudinally and see what happens to them. So
and their exposure status might change, but it's not really cases of some mental disorder versus controls. Okay.
Okay. There was some mention in one of your slides about controls. I think that's where the confusion.
Right. So so at age 4, we had like 2 of our sites in particular. Well, I guess in 50% of the southern site, those kids were not maltreated at the time, but were matched on high-risk sociodemographic risk factors. So we've never considered or looked at them separately. When we do analyses, we primarily look, do they have any maltreatment up to this age and they're in this group versus not in this group? Is the sample as a whole is all high risk? We didn't necessarily want to look at high risk separate from maltreatment because we kind of knew that the high risk kids were probably going to also be exposed. So we don't talk about it necessarily that way.
Okay.
It's a observational, psychological, epidemiological study in its finest. Complicated and messy. Any other questions on that? So, and I did not break this out by maltreated versus non-maltreated, just looking generally at the youth's own report about whether or not they had witnessed an event, a violent event. In the last year, of course, at age 8, it was age 12 was in the last year, 14 and 16. So there's a little bit of increase over time, not a big increase, the decrease at 16. They pretty much stay pretty exposed. These questions in terms of violence exposure, have you ever seen anybody beaten up, threatened with a weapon, murdered, stabbed, sexually victimized? Those are the majority of questions that are around this sort of exposure to violence. We didn't necessarily break down whether it was in the school or community to some extent. Not sure that it matters as much as they were exposed in some context. So a lot of them, over close to 70%, by the time that they're 16, have witnessed one or more events. If they were maltreated, they were more likely to report also witnessing violence in other contexts. It's consistent with literature. So in terms of mental health, we were very fortunate to be able to use child behavior checklist at age 4, 6, 8, 10, 14, 16. And then the child behavior checklist, that's Achenbach's measure, also has a teacher component and a youth component. So we also have teacher reports over time up till about 13, though we have a lot of missing data for teachers. And then the youth self-reported on the youth self-report, the same measure, but for the youth at age 18 and 16. So these are internalizing problems. Achenbach's measure, you can either get T-scores or raw scores. For research, they tend to suggest the raw scores, there's more variability. Also means standard deviations are crazy. But these are the trajectories over to 16. The confusion is the sort of yellow line potentially. So for the yellow line, that's a combination of both youth self-report and CPS report over time. So I separated it out CPS report because that wouldn't be confounded with time. So it was CPS reports by 4 and the caregiver reporting on the child behavior at 4. But for the yellow line, that's looking backwards. So the kids saying that they had been maltreated in combination with CPS reports, and what did their age 4 behavior problems, 6, 8, 12 look like?
And a lower number is better.
Yes, lower is better.
So what's the vertical axis? I'm sorry.
What is the who? What?
What's the vertical
Oh,
axis?
that is the number of is the score on the child behavior checklist. It's low. I think clinical range is 35. So most of the kids tend to score on the lower end, but we do have a higher percentage of kids who are maltreated also scoring a clinical range for both internalizing and externalizing problems. Internalizing when you get to the youth report, not so much the caregivers report. Caregivers are not that great at reporting on internalizing problems. Depression, feeling down, sad, things like that. And for comparison, let's see. They were significant differences at 8, 12, 14, and 16 for differentiating maltreated from non-maltreated. Which might make sense. It's hard to figure out internalizing problems of a 4-year-old. Though we do have other measures that do a little bit better at that. For externalizing problems, so from the previous slide, internalizing problems are going up. We're not really sure why they're going up. Is it because they're better at exhibiting internalizing problems as they get older? A lot of it could be that our maltreated kids are re-victimized in different contexts later, particularly in adolescence, and that may be partially responsible for the increase over time. For those where externalizing problems by comparison tend to either stabilize or decline to some extent. So those are what those look like.
Terri, could you define, what do you mean by externalizing?
Externalizing, okay. So externalizing problems would be acting out behaviors, aggressive behaviors, violent behaviors, argumentative, it's on the delinquency and violence subscales of the CBCL. Whereas internalizing would be depression, withdrawal, some post-traumatic symptoms, inattention, some things along those lines. So they decline to some extent. Significant differences pretty much every time point. And again, these are caregiver reported symptoms. Okay. All right. Oh, I'm going backwards. Okay. So psychological disorders. Remember that gap I mentioned in funding between age 8 and 14? Well, at age 14, prior to that, the Administration for Children, Youth, and Families were supporting the research. At age 14, the National Institute of Mental Health kicked in some money, and we implemented, because of that funding, the diagnostic interview schedule for children, computerized version from NIMH. And that is like a diagnostic interview for diagnostic purposes to indicate whether the kids had would meet diagnostic criteria for any number of psychological disorders. I've grouped them here by behavioral disorders, anxiety disorders, mood disorders, and substance use disorders. Behavioral disorders would include ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress, specific phobias, generalized anxiety disorders. Mood disorders included major depression, dysthymia, mania, and then substance use disorders include tobacco, alcohol, marijuana primarily, and then there was also an illicit drug section on that as well. We administered the disc at 14 and 18. I just have the 14 data here. We had 27% of our kids scored in the diagnostic range for one or more behavioral disorders, and it was not uncommon for them to meet diagnostic criteria for more than one. And anxiety disorders were also common, mood disorders less so. And just to remember, at age 14, we had 4% and 2% of our sample who scored in the diagnostic level for substance use disorders. Pretty concerning for 14. Probably most of that tobacco. And I'll show you those slides here shortly. Just for comparison purposes, NIMH has, similar to the other national surveys, they have data out And by comparison, national data for kids 8 to 15, or for that particular sample, 13% had one or more diagnosable disorders, and we already have 27% at 14. For anxiety disorder, less than 1% of their sample scored in the range for diagnostic criteria for an anxiety disorder, where we had significantly more than that. Mood disorders are actually about the same. They had 4%, and our maltreated group was at 5%. And then substance use disorders, they don't even list for 8 to 15-year-olds.
So why is your not maltreated sample different than the nationally representative sample?
The national represented sample is probably going to be community samples. Mm-hmm. Ours are high risk. So even without maltreatment, they're all high risk on some sociodemographic factor or exposure.
High risk for the outcomes or high risk for the
high risk
exposure?
For any possible outcome, but yes, for exposure as well.
Yeah, but they are not exposed. They're high risk, but not
exposed.
For
these are maltreated, non-maltreated, so I didn't even include witnessing violence in there. Mm-hmm. So these are just based on CPS and self-report alone.
Not what they witness.
So the maltreated kids may not be self-reporting or have CPS reports, but they could be witnessing violence. Mm-hmm. And so the whole sample is high risk. It's how we sort of cut the pie to look at the outcome. But that's why probably all of them are elevated over national in general, but even just looking at maltreatment, we still have a higher risk rate among our maltreated kids versus not considering violence exposures. Any other questions? So, in terms of our tobacco use over time, we asked the kids to self-report their own use of substances at 12. At 14, we got it from the responses to the diagnostic interview schedule for children for the substance use modules. And 16 and 18 were also self-report. 16 and 18 are from the same measure. 14 is from the diagnostic interview schedule for children. Age 12 is from an entirely different measure. Welcome to developmental, longitudinal analyses. Measures change over time. It gets very difficult. But for the purposes of this, instead of looking, because sometimes the way we ask frequency in different ways over time, last 30 days versus last year. So these are self-reports of any use ever at these different time points. So theoretically, they should not go down at 18, if anybody was wondering about that. So here's the couple things. First, it is a longitudinal study. There's attrition. Our attrition is funny because our kids move in and out of the study. So they may miss an interview, they may miss 5 interviews, but they may come back in. So the data at each time point is not always, it's the same pool, but not always the same kids at every time point. Attrition is tough. We have, looking between, like from 8 to 10 or 4 to 6, our retention is higher. Over time, all the way to 18, I think we had 65% of the baseline sample had data at 18. But again, at different time points, it changes over time.
So, sorry, a methodological question. Given what you said, how appropriate is to do this kind of an analysis?
Well, it's not analysis exactly. I'm just reporting means over time or prevalence over time of reported. When we do studies, and I'll talk about a little bit about the desistance study if I have time, actually, at this point, but then that represents a challenge. And there are other 2 options. You could do case-wise deletion, so you're only using those who have data at all time points. You could do imputation. We in Longscan have never done imputation. There's really 2 very different fields about the utility of imputed data. So it tends to be case-wise deletion, or we use statistical methods where they do full maximum likelihood estimates and try to use all available data. So that's generally what we do. But these are just prevalence over time on the sample from the data that are available at the time. So alcohol use as well, and marijuana use. I should preface by saying that we started data collection in the 90s. So we completed data collection around 2012 for our youngest group, which would have been around 18 and around 2012. So particularly with marijuana, that may look a little bit different now than it did at the time. I do know that I think 32% of our young adults now report marijuana use, 62% alcohol use, and 37% tobacco use as adults. I'm not sure how that compares to monitoring the future data. I only looked at that for the younger kids, but then it's not really comparable because these are from so long ago. Delinquent behaviors, I guess I need to do that a little bit. At age 12, 14, 16, all again different measures over time. And to deal with the frequency of engaging, for this, we just said if you engaged in anything more than one time, you were considered as exhibiting delinquent behavior. Age 12 was the adolescent delinquency survey. Age 14 was the conduct disorder module from the child, the diagnostic interview schedule. And age 16 was, again, another self-reported delinquent behavior measure. And
Sorry.
yes.
Delinquent behavior. Could you define that?
Yes.
Is that like shoplifting and what is delinquent behavior?
That's included, yes.
Okay.
It could be a range. So at 12, we asked 10 items. For 12, including have you ever been arrested? Have you taken part in what others would consider gang activity? Shoplifting, theft, property destruction, arson, threatening someone with a weapon. We asked about running away and truancy. At 12, 14, got a lot bigger. 14, now we're also asked about cruelty to animals, sexual victimization of others. Again, it's a developmental study. We're following these kids. So what's appropriate to ask at 12 is, becomes a little different at 14 and 16. But they generally mirror Moffitt's adolescent limited course in terms of what she and her partners did, looking at the duodenum study over time, where there's a decline about mid-adolescence, those adolescent limited, consistent high offenders, and then the low offenders. And ours tend to sort of mirror that over time. Okay. So in terms of highlights from Longscan in general, and I'll quickly run through the other parts of it. Maltreatment is only one of a myriad of experiences that these kids encounter, and it is not always the worst. Substantiation, we looked at allegation and substantiation. Even if you're called into CPS, you're just at risk of poor outcomes as if the CPS substantiated the allegation. Maltreated youth overall exhibit more behavioral problems, less healthy, and engage in more risk behaviors as adolescents. And the severity, timing, context of exposure, and chronicity are important, which is why you need a developmental study. So again, I'm just going to speed through like super, super quick. We've done a number of ancillary studies to follow or do secondary analysis from Longscan, including pregnancy and birth outcomes, violence exposure trajectories, HIV, substance use. And the one I want to talk about very quickly, identifying protective factors, reducing violence among maltreated youth. That was funded by NICHD. It was in RO3. And these are some analyses from that. Quickly, the rationale. A lot of kids are exposed and a lot of kids do bad things. Homicide is the second leading cause of death among that young adolescent and young adults. More than 700,000 kids are presenting to ERs with violence-related injuries. 752,000 arrests of persons under 18, and I believe 28% of those are kids under 15. Arrests of girls, although arrests overall have declined for both genders, arrests for girls are increasing in certain areas: burglary, larceny, property theft, according to most recent FBI statistics. There's a higher rate of offending among maltreated girls compared to boys, and a higher rate of serious offending among maltreated girls compared to boys. But maltreated girls also have the higher rate of re-victimization than do boys. So gender is an important thing to consider in terms of delinquency and violent behavior. Once kids start to get into the system, they have harsher punishments. They're more likely to be placed in formalized detention and jail. More likely to be recidivism rates are higher. worse school attendance. And once you get involved in the criminal justice system as adults, tend to be lower employment, lower economic, and tend to not reach adult milestones that are protective like marriage, tend to be stay single longer. So the trajectory is quite significant. So one of the things that we need to do in terms of public health and prevention and intervention is how do we find the protective factors or things that insulate these kids if nearly 60% are being exposed to one or more kinds of violence. So some promotive factors that have been assessed in extant literature tend to be done with community samples and sometimes disadvantaged urban samples. And they are couched within this ecological system and include gender. For example, girls are less likely to engage in delinquent behaviors than boys. Higher IQ are less likely to engage than those with lower IQ, etc. Parental monitoring, parent-child relationships, pro-social activities, religiosity, just about everything has sort of been examined. Most as compensatory behaviors, so that is, are there main effects for these that reduce the chance of delinquency? And then there are some that do some protective factors work, which where they interact the adverse effect with some of these promotive factors to see if they're protective as opposed to promotive. Sorry, I'm just going really fast now. So the problem is that most of the studies have looked at kids at a single time point and retrospectively assessed exposures. But protective factors and risk factors are not always stable over time. The kids change what they're doing over time. They may be resilient or maladaptive in one age time point, but not in others. There's a lot of work to look at what reduces delinquency, but not a lot in terms of what is associated with desistance once they're already involved in delinquent behaviors. And not a lot of gender difference studies, tend to focus on males primarily. And not looking at stability of risk and promotive factors over time, or whether there are particularly developmentally sensitive periods in which intervention would make more sense. So for these, we were looking at whether previously documented promotive factors would be protective for maltreated youth who were already engaging in delinquency at age 12, and looking at age 14 outcomes, and then look at the path, whether there are similar pathways for girls and boys. We CPS, combined CPS and self-report. At age 12 is the Adolescent Delinquency Survey, age 14 the DISC. The Parental Monitoring Survey, that's a 5-item measure. We asked both the caregivers and the parents. It includes things like how much do you know about where your child is at night? And we asked the kids, how much does your parent know where you are at night? How they spend the money, who their friends are. The correlation between the two informants is 0.32. It is significant. Not surprisingly, kids don't think parents know as much as parents think they know. So for that, we took both the kids' report and the parents' report, and then we averaged those. Pro-social friends, we looked at whether the friends were engaged in sports activities, church attendance, whether their grades were important to them. And school orientation and behavior problems for academic achievement, that's a single item that says how important is it for you to do well in school. Crazy how one item can really make a difference. So for this, we reduced the sample down to just those kids who had CPS or self-reported maltreatment and who had indicated at age 12 that they were engaging in delinquent behavior. They had to have both an age 12 and an age 14 assessment. So by the time we limited that sample down, it was 186, which is fairly small. Slightly overrepresented in boys, and the sample demographics are pretty similar to the baseline long scan sample. Okay, in terms of our distribution of variables, parental monitoring is 0 to 3, pro-social friends also 0 to 3, and importance of academic achievement is on a 4-point Likert scale. So for those that desisted, about 60%, no, not quite 60%, did not say they were engaging at 14 and had desisted, about half the sample. For the desisters, they were higher in all of these 3 domains compared to those who were continuing to engage at age 14. That difference is significant across the board for t-tests in terms of the differences in groups. So first thing we want to do is look at gender differences, both on whether there were different gender differences on the factors themselves, but also then the impact of these factors on desistance. We did a logistic regression. We controlled for gender in the full model, race, ethnicity, study site, because we do have the study. We always control for study site because they have always are predictive of study. Parental monitoring, academic, and then we stratified the models by gender and to look at gender-specific models. So in the distribution of variables, what we find is that even though the desister group is higher on all the protective factors, it's only significant for boys. The girls are not significantly different in the desister and non-desister group.
And again, is higher better or lower?
Higher is better, so there's more parental monitoring. As the scores go up, parental monitoring is higher, reports of parental monitoring, pro-social friends is higher, more of their friends are engaged in pro-social activities, and the rated importance of academic achievement is higher. Higher is better. You can stop me.
It's desistance from
Delinquent behaviors. Yeah, so these were,
14.
yes, from 12 to 14, right. So the desisters would be those who at 14 did not endorse engaging in any of those behaviors. Questions? Then the full and gender stratified models, only parental monitoring and importance of academic achievement were predictive in the full model. And in the gender stratified models, it was only predictive for boys. It's just an interesting thing with the girls.
So these are odds ratios that you're showing.
Yeah, otherwise the slide was a little crazy. So, and the outcome in terms of logistic regression was a 1 for being in desister. So you're predicting desistance. Question there. Sorry, I'm like, so limitations, small sample size. So 186 is not a lot to work with, and especially in gender stratified models, we only had 73 for the girls. So some of that might benefit from a little power analysis to see if the girls were actually not, maybe those things weren't predicted for the girls, just the power was low. But we have found in long scan that our girls are just different. And so I think that continues to call for more gender-related examinations, particularly in the area of desistance, because we really do have a dearth of research that focuses on girls. There were different measures across time, could be problematic. We didn't account for type of offending behaviors. They could have been offending at 12 on like something like shoplifting $5, and on 14 shoplifting $5, or they could have been shoplifting $5 at 12 and murdering somebody at 14. So we didn't account for offending behavior, or whether those who were involved in petty stuff were more likely to be the sisters as opposed to those that were involved in more dangerous or personal violence at 12. And then, of course, we relied on these own self-report.
And did you have the ones who got caught and who were sent to jail?
We do ask them
Or
about...
sent to detention? I mean,
Yeah. We ask about that, if they've ever been arrested or they've ever been sent to juvie.
But if they were, you wanted to survey them at 14, you wouldn't have had them in your study because they had to have both a 12-year and a 14-year.
Yeah, we did. They weren't necessarily. I think the one of our sites actually did go to juvenile detention for a couple of their kids if they knew where they were. So there certainly could have been some that we missed at 14 because they were in juvie, but we didn't know they were in juvie or incarcerated. But these were restricted to the sample where we had both reports. So implications, there does tend to be some promotive capabilities of what I think are important because these parental monitoring, importance of academic achievement, these are modifiable factors. Genetics gets a little harder to modify. These are modifiable factors. Maybe we have some opportunities for intervention, but we may need to look more closely about what might work better for girls versus boys. And we have age 16 and 18 data. Now we have young adult data, so these analyses can be extended out. To look at that, as well as cumulative effective factors across time, and the stability of risk and promotive factors. And because we have longitudinal data over time and a number of violence exposures, I think there are some good opportunities to do latent class or latent profile analyses where statistically we group individuals based on their experiences to learn more about outcomes that way. Because it is complex. We ask a lot about these kids in a number of different domains, as well as looking at the mediating and moderating effects of substance use mental health problems on ultimately young adult criminal behavior. Going really fast, sorry. Big picture, people are complex. They really are. Behavior is really influenced by a multiplicity of factors. We do single time point, single exposure studies are really missing a lot of what makes people complicated and a lot of what influences human development. Variance in race risk are generally typically small, especially in psychological research, and consequences, however, are significant. In terms of priorities, injury and violence prevention remain public health priorities. APHA has also indicated that gun violence is one of their priorities. There's also an emphasis in terms of grant funding on shared risk and protective factors across types of exposures and outcomes, and increasing expectations of team science and interdisciplinary collaborative efforts that may bridge genomics, psychology, behavioral epidemiology, social, environmental exposures together to understand better some of these current outcomes. And I'll just leave that up there as you read. These are current projects, some that are under review already and some that are planned, but I think I'm like 5 minutes over, so sorry.
Thank you very much.
Yes. First, does do that.
Very good question. So, one question.
I did it. I planned that.
Can you explain again what you're differentiating between promotive and protective factors?
Yes. So this is they call them the same thing a lot in the literature. The CDC at one point was very particular about how they wanted promotive and protective factors used in the definition of each. Promotive factors are those that are considered compensatory. So if you think of it statistically, they are main effects associated with less risk of something. Protective factors are those factors that for kids already at risk or on that are already some risk behavior. It's basically trying to find factors that are protective in the face of adversity that impacts resilient functioning. So those are generally modeled as interactions, the exposure with the promotive factor, and that's considered protective because it's insulating a risk, whereas compensatory is just a main effect that it works for everybody in the same direction. Does that make sense? They're used interchangeably in the literature a lot. I kind of made my protective factors compensatory by subsetting the sample the way that I did so that I wasn't looking at interactions with, in part because there's only 186. Yeah. It's hard to find significant interaction and moderating effects with 186 kids.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you, so sorry.